So President Biden recently hosted an event to talk about the US target of clean energy vehicles by 2030 and their plan of investment of how to achieve that. From that speech, it triggered a strong rally amongst EV related stocks. So I want to talk a little bit about how that will impact retail investors like me and you. And don't worry, I'll definitely get to why Tesla was not invited to the event in this video as well. And then the second thing I want to talk about is US halting all Chinese IPOs until they can disclose their risk appropriately. This is pretty scary for any investors with any kind of Chinese stock exposure. And I have Chinese stock exposure in two places, which I will talk a little bit about towards the end of this video as well. As usual, if you learn something new, it will mean the world to me if you could gently smash a like button somewhere around here. And if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel via Patreon, where you get some extra perks on Discord. And no, this video is not financial advice or recommendation to do anything. So without further ado, let's go! With President Biden's speech, what you really need to know is that he signed an executive order setting a target for electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell, and plug-in hybrid vehicles to make up 50% of US sales by 2030. Now, the thing about this is that this is a voluntary goal, which means that the automakers don't exactly have to fulfill that promise. More importantly, the president believes that by investing in these four items, it will definitely help their chances to reclaim EV leadership. Now, the first item is installing the first ever national network of electric vehicle charging station. So this will be really good for companies like ChargePoint. Delivering point of sale consumer incentives to spur US and manufacturing union jobs. Financing and retooling the expansion of full domestic manufacturing supply chain. This will be really important and a big investable trend. And lastly, innovating the next generation of clean tech to maintain our competitive edge. As a retail investor, I'm not here to try and comment on whether policies are good or bad. My main objective is just to determine what trend is investable and try and jump on a tailwind that's big enough that will lift all boats, because that tends to be a lot more forgiving. So from that perspective, President Biden's comments and their targets around cleaner energy vehicles is just confirming that EVs remains to be one of the biggest opportunities in this decade. But there are multiple parts to this EV tailwind. So with the EV tailwind, I think that there are three major components. You have the automakers who make the cars, and then you have the battery supply chain, which ultimately feeds the battery cells to the automakers to make the cars. And then you have the charging stations or the charging network companies that enable electric vehicles to be charged. Within the battery supply chain component, there is battery manufacturers who essentially leverage the raw materials to make the battery cells. And then you have the companies that extracts the raw materials from Earth. Now this graph is a little bit old, but if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that these are the top battery manufacturers in the world. Panasonic, LG Chem, Samsung SDI, and because this graph is a bit old, CATL and SK Innovation should belong to a tier 1 battery manufacturer. These tiers are just determined by the amount of output. The good thing is that a lot of the top tier battery manufacturers are actually accessible by retail investors via ETFs. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. When we look at the raw material side of things, there's quite a bit of materials that's required to make these battery cells. And in each of the category of raw materials, there are top producers. For example, lithium, the top producers are Albemarle, SQM, Ganfeng, Tenchi, Levant. These two are Chinese, the rest is mostly US listed, so it's actually quite accessible by retail investors. So what I'm trying to say is that all of this make a great investable opportunity as long as you're willing to put time into it, because understanding these companies are very different to try and understand a company like Amazon. Now, on top of that, there are companies that own the charging stations, and these could make an additional investable opportunity as well. For example, ChargePoint owns a network of chargers, and we can go beyond that and think about who else make these chargers for ChargePoint. Like for example, Nissan, ABB, Blink, Bosch, they actually make the fast chargers for some of the charging network or charging stations. So that could be another investable opportunity that's worthwhile looking into. I'm personally not that interested in this category. That's why I haven't really talked about it all that much on my channel. Now, of course, the last component is by far the biggest component of them all, is to look at the car companies that actually make the electric vehicles. If we look at the top 5 brands in 2020, Tesla is the only American brand out of the 5. SAIC and BYD are Chinese companies. Volkswagen and Renault, these are European companies. So what's really interesting to me is that the top American brand that is really moving the electric vehicle revolution forward wasn't invited, along with the Detroit automakers. So they're talking about GM, Ford, and Stellantis. So when asked why Tesla wasn't invited to the event, White House press secretary essentially said that these are the 3 largest employers of the United Auto Workers. So that's a union. So I will let you draw your own conclusions. Right. And what really bothers me is that if you listen to the opening address by President Biden on why there is no reason that the US can't reclaim the EV leadership, he specifically called out GM as the reason for why they gathered for that event in the first place. So just completely ignoring that Tesla was pushing these companies to go electric. And more importantly, this is the CEO that really needs to explain what the heck happened with this company right here. If you're wondering what happened to this company, just look at the stock chart and that will basically tell you the whole story. Supposedly, GM have done the due diligence and this happened. So from a retail investor perspective, we have to be really careful with these rallies of legacy automakers like GM and Ford. Because if I was a betting man, those are not the candidates that I would put my own capital on to help US reclaim their EV leadership. So the second thing I want to talk about is the US blocking all Chinese IPOs until risks are better disclosed. I mean, how could you blame them? This is really coming from the perspective that China is clamping down on their tech and education industry. And if you want to know my full take on that, I have made a dedicated video on that, on whether China is still investable. So feel free to check out that video after this one. But before I give my take on the US blocking all Chinese IPOs, I wanted to show you this graph right here. Now, KWEB US Equity is essentially an ETF that tracks the Chinese internet giants. And this ETF have approximately $5 billion in net assets. And as Chinese tech started tanking, you can see there's a record inflow of institutions buying into this ETF. Now, unfortunately, there's no way to know who exactly is doing that because I would love to know who's doing that. But these amounts are not small at all. You can see that these blocks are essentially in 100 millions. So this will be 100 million, 200 million, 300 million. And there were a couple of days where there is more than $300 million worth of inflow into this ETF, which is ginormous, by the way. Now, we'll have to wait and see who exactly is doubling down on pure Chinese tech. But personally speaking, I'm not brave enough to do that. But I also don't plan on selling my exposure in Asia, just because if you look closely into the Asia ETF, there are some very important hard tech companies like Samsung, TSM, SK Hynix that's actually really hard for a retail investor like me to access. In saying that, I also have exposure to hard tech in Asia via Global X's battery tech ETF. This is more concentrated in battery tech companies globally, especially the battery manufacturers in China. But the good thing is, if you look through the list of companies and look at the tickers specifically, I'm getting exposure to the Hong Kong version of those companies, which makes me less anxious about ownership problems. And I think this would be a really good time for me to do a portfolio update. So when it comes to a portfolio update, my CMC market portfolio side of things is worth around 106,000 Australian dollars. And as of recording this video, I haven't really changed the portfolio all that much. Asia, of course, is bleeding, which is understandable. Micron, which is a semiconductors play, have recovered to $82, which is really good to see. Novonix had a really nice boost after the President Biden speech. Talga is more associated with the EU, so unless they have made progress towards their mines or there's some kind of big EU announcement, that's probably not going to move all that much. And Volpara is doing Volpara things. As many of you know, I have sized my positions very specifically when it comes to some of these companies. So I'm not too fast that even if a company is down like 17%, I will just wait and see. I will be depositing more cash into this account. I'm currently sitting at around 4% cash, probably try and build it up to around 5%. With my stake portfolio, it's currently worth around 45,000 US dollars, which is give or take approximately 65,000 Australian dollars. And with this side of the portfolio, I'm very happy with what I have. Even though that some people being screaming that Tesla is incredibly expensive or overvalued, but if I had the choice between Tesla versus the other car makers, I would not put my money in the other car makers whatsoever. That's my own belief, so make sure you do your own due diligence on that. The rest I am really happy with, even though that there's been a lot of drama in Disney lately that I am not going to talk about. The one thing I do want to mention is that LIT is the ETF I mentioned that gives me exposure to Chinese battery tech companies. And of course, I wish that it was different in the sense that I had more exposure in LIT and less exposure in Asia ETF. But yeah, would have never known that would be the case. And I'm very happy with this position currently. As always, I'm not sponsored by Stake, but if you do want to try Stake for yourself, I have left a link in the description box below. Thank you so much for hanging out with me all the way to the end. If you did learn something new, consider gently smacking the like button right there. Subscribe to my channel, click onto the bell so that when I release future videos, I can let you know. If you're still bored, I left a video on the screen that I think it's incredible to watch next. And as usual, Otto will always do the honors, and I'm gonna see you very soon.